There we go. All right, welcome everyone to webinar 2 of Using Library of Congress Resources to Build a Historical Argument. Tonight for webinar 2, we are welcoming our esteemed guest professor, Dr. Christopher Hamner. Dr. Hamner is going to be talking to us tonight about historical analysis. And as always, our thanks to the Library of Congress and Teaching with Primary Sources for funding and supporting this wonderful initiative. So with that, I will let you advance to the housekeeping slide. This should be old information for those of you who either watched or attended live to the first webinar. If you have any questions at all during tonight's session, use the Q&A box. You will be able to communicate with me and Alondra. We are both personing the Q&A box and we'll get our answers to you as soon as we're able. This is how you will also ask questions at the end of the night during the Q&A session. You should see at the bottom of your screen that live captioning is on. This helps us to ensure accessibility in the recording. If this is bothersome to you or distracting to you, you can easily turn that off. If you just hover over, you should be able to minimize that. A reminder that the survey at the end of tonight's session, for which you will receive a QR code or a link, is required for your attendance. Tomorrow morning, I will post slides and a recording of this live session on Google Classroom under Webinar 2 materials. Again, you should be familiar with where this exists in the Google Classroom universe. You have a little bit of time before the next assignment is due. So assignment 2 for this module is due in about 10 days on Friday, February 14th. We're going to spend a bit more time near the end of tonight's session going over some details about that. But you have those 10 days so you can really take in the information delivered by Dr. Hamner tonight, because you're going to put the information to good use in your assignments. Additionally, information about the next module, Module 3, meaning we will already be halfway done with this webinar series, will be available next Friday, February 14th. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Hamner.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to the Library of Congress for making this possible, but mostly thank you all to you folks in the audience for taking some time out in the middle of your week to do a little historical thinking. I don't know exactly where you are, but I'm here in Northern Virginia, and we have a winter storm warning in effect. It looks like there is cold weather, snow, sleet, freezing rain headed our way. It feels just a little weird out there tonight. It feels like a good night to be sitting someplace cozy and thinking about primary sources. So I'm really glad that you guys have taken some time tonight. And I'm really excited to jump in, pick back up with some of the themes that we talked about in our first webinar, and begin adding some second order thinking skills. So the program as a whole is really about process, right? We're trying to think about and better understand the ways that historians take the raw material of primary sources and transform them into historical interpretation and historical argument. I'm using this David Blight book on Frederick Douglass with my own students this semester, and I'm being put right back into touch with how brilliant his analysis and his interpretation is. And the biggest goal we have is to help demystify that process, both for us as teachers and hopefully for our students, give us some ideas about how to talk with historians who are still developing these skills as they improve with them. In our first webinar last month, we talked about the 4 historical thinking skills: sourcing, close reading, corroboration, and contextualization. Those are the building blocks. We're going to touch on some of them tonight. One of the things that we got in the feedback from the first webinar was that people really seem to benefit from the think alouds. So when I sit and engage with a source and just tell you what my internal monologue is doing, I've actually started doing that a lot more with my undergraduates this semester. I'd kind of gotten a little bit out of the habit. And I've started doing it now twice in every class session. I have 2 documents and I'll do a think aloud and I'll ask them to kind of reflect on what they're hearing as training for themselves. We're going to do more of that tonight because I think it can be a really powerful pedagogical technique. You're practicing both for yourself and with your students the historical thinking skills, and these are the keys to interpreting individual sources. So if you're getting a new source, this is the set of tools that I use to try to pick the lock and figure out what that source means and what it might be telling me. I think of the historical thinking skills in some ways like the notes of the C major scale, right? It's the basic stuff you need to learn and practice and master to be able to do the kind of higher order things that historians do. But nobody wants to sit around and listen to somebody just play the notes of the C major scale up and down. What we really want to hear is some music. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about the ways that historians harness these historical thinking skills and use them to study change over time. Interpreting primary sources is only a part of this larger job. What we're really trying to get to anytime we sit down and do history is to assemble all of that primary source evidence into an argument that explains something, that explains some kind of change over time that we've seen. That's what historical interpretation is. It's the process of gathering primary sources, fitting them together, and then making an argument about what they say in their entirety. Most of the time, what historians want to answer about change over time has something to do with cause and effect. What is changing and what is making it change? And I sat down and I brainstormed just, a dozen questions off the top of my head that I thought historians could use historical interpretation and historical analysis to answer. But anytime you pick up a history book or a class syllabus, or you sit down and watch a documentary, somewhere in there are built in these questions about cause and effect. Why do things happen? What makes them happen? How do we know? This is I think, the heart of historical interpretation. It's why we want to spend all this time with primary sources, to figure out answers to puzzling things about the past. What I want to spend most of our time on tonight is talking about some higher level historical thinking interpretation that draws on the four core historical thinking skills and draws on primary sources and gives historians a way to generate some insights from primary sources, a way to squeeze meaning out of them in ways that will enable us to answer some of those questions about cause and effect. So we're going to focus on three of them: perspective, agency, and hindsight. And there's probably another half dozen things that historians do pretty commonly that we could talk about. But these are three that I find myself using with my students a lot and encouraging them to think about the sources that they are interpreting and analyzing. This is a good starter kit to help get you moving. So let's start with perspective. And perspective is just the awareness that historical actors, the people in the past, have a relationship to the events they're involved in. And also that we, the observers, the scholars working in the present, have a relationship to events too. Now that sounds maybe a little bit confusing, but to me, it boils down to a series of pretty straightforward questions. Who produced the thing that we're looking at? What kinds of interests does the person or the group producing the source have? And how do their interests affect or involve their interpretation of events? Now, if you're thinking about those questions, you probably notice there's some familiar things there, right? There's a little bit of sourcing going on from our basic toolbox. There's a little bit of contextualization going on. And that's why I think of this second order set of interpretive tools as kind of built out of the basic building blocks. So we're putting together sourcing, close reading, corroboration, and contextualization together in different ways to give us some things that might enable us to unleash a fresh insight into the past. Perspective is really important because, as any historian will tell you, every source has a perspective. It is just inescapable that every person or every group in the past bring some sort of perspective with them. And this gets us to one of the kind of hot button words that comes up all the time when I'm teaching 18 and 19-year-olds, and that is the red letter word bias. My students will very frequently get their hands on a document or a source or a text, and they will get somewhere, into their close reading, and they'll say, wait a minute, isn't this source biased? Isn't there a bias here? And bias, I think, to the average 18 or 19-year-old has a very pejorative meaning, right? It's a negative thing. You don't want to show bias. And one of the things that I work with my students to do is to kind of unlearn this reflex that if you detect bias in a source, you automatically have to throw it out, which is the sort of reflex that a lot of my students have. They'll say, well, isn't this biased? Shouldn't we throw this away because of the bias? And this is why I like to use the term perspective instead of bias. Bias, because it has that pejorative connotation, people say, I might want to avoid that. Perspective is a little more, it's a more neutral term. And it allows us to kind of come to grips with the fact that everything has a perspective. If we were to go back to one of the great Library of Congress documents, this rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, it's Thomas Jefferson's original version, complete with the emendations and the crossouts. I just love this document. Of course, it has a perspective. Jefferson is rich, he's white, he's a Virginian, he's a slaver, he's highly educated, and all of those things affect this document and affect the choices that he made in producing this draft. Now, if you use the term bias, you say, does the Declaration of Independence have a bias? It absolutely does. Based on who drafts it and who endorses it, it protects a particular set of interests. But I wouldn't want to say, well, I've detected bias in the Declaration of Independence, and therefore, as a historian, I have to throw it out because it's not objective. I think really good historians acknowledge that there is going to be a perspective present in any primary source you look at. And rather than say, we have to throw this out because it has a bias, say, let's understand what the perspective is. And as we're reading and interpreting this, let's make sure that we're aware of that perspective, which is often kind of unspoken or implicit, and that we filter our analysis through our understanding of the perspective. Another great document that we referenced in our first webinar is this undated, unsigned letter that's sent to Dr. Martin Luther King. We know now that this was generated by someone within the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And if you read the letter, I mean, it's downright chilling. It's very sinister. It is a blackmail threat. The author purports to have evidence about things in King's personal life and sort of suggests towards the end that King should take his own life. And it's terribly biased, right? It has a terribly negative attitude towards Dr. Martin Luther King, the recipient, towards the idea of civil rights, towards the civil rights movement itself. It's incredibly negative when you think that this is generated by an agent of the government. There's bias all over this document. I wouldn't want to throw it out on that basis. It's so fascinating, and it's fascinating in large part because it is so biased and because it is so ominous and sinister. A good historian doesn't say, this is biased, we have to throw this out, but says, what do I need to know about the perspective of this document in order to make sense of it, in order to fit it in with other things? And that's one of the central things. There is no such thing as an unbiased source. Every source has a perspective. And rather than say, I only want to look at things that are completely objective, a good historian says, what do I need to be aware of regarding this document in terms of the historical actor's relationship to the events? There's no shortage of places that we could kind of follow this idea. One of the great collections at the Library of Congress is their collection of World War II propaganda posters. This is a terrific one that I use with my students all the time. It's a 1943 poster that has a kind of triumphant and inspirational message that American GIs are marching off to war in Europe, just as their predecessors in the Continental Army, 150, doing the math, 150 years previous had done, because that's what Americans do. Americans fight for liberty. And so it has this very positive, inspiring message. But there's a perspective here. This is a document that is generated by the United States government. It has a very specific audience in mind. It is trying to drum up support for the war effort, and it's trying to drum up a particular kind of enthusiasm that the war that Americans are fighting is not one of self-interest, but is one of magnanimity, right? Bringing freedom to the oppressed peoples of the world. It's useful to know that perspective if you're trying to make sense of this document. And good historians are always bringing in other sources. If you're thinking about wartime propaganda, one of the most interesting sources you can bring in is opponents' depictions of the war effort, because what your enemies say about your country is often strikingly at odds with what your own country says. Here's a propaganda poster that is generated by the Nazi regime in 1944. It's referencing the same American war effort, and yet the depiction is starkly different. And it's kind of horrifying in its depiction of the American war effort, not as, bringing liberty to the oppressed, but as this kind of horrifying machine. And there's just no, you could spend 15 minutes with your class picking out details from the Ku Klux Klan hood and the lynching noose hanging off the shoulder to the sort of left leg of this creature with a blood-spattered bomb. There's a Tommy gun and an arm holding a sack full of cash, and it's this very, horrifying kind of Frankenstein's monster of the American war effort, and all of it is presented under what I have to assume is a kind of sardonic title, liberators, right? That Americans claim they are liberators, but here is what they really are, this kind of horrifying war machine that is trampling in clouds of bloody fire red smoke the great cities of Europe. Both of these documents have a perspective. Neither one of them is what we would consider objective. And rather than say, well, this is propaganda, it has a bias, we're going to throw it out, what we really want to do is say, what do I need to know about the perspective? And how am I going to allow that knowledge, or how am I going to use that knowledge to inform the kind of analysis and interpretation that I perform? So that's a quick introduction to perspective. Let's turn our attention to the second of the three kind of higher level interpretive skills, and that's agency. Agency, for my money, is the most valuable and useful and important thing that a historian can think about as we're trying to make sense of the events of the past. So in our first webinar, I suggested that close reading is the really unusually powerful tool in the kit of historical thinking skills. For me, at this point in my career, thinking about agency is the thing that really opens up the most insights, and often unleashes new questions that I have to ask to get even more deeply into the sources. So let's talk a little bit about what it is. It's a concept that most of us are familiar with, and it's a word that we hear a lot in various contexts, and yet coming up with a precise definition can be a little tricky. I think a kind of rough guide of agency is the ability to make consequential decisions, the ability to affect the course of history. When I talk about this with my students, they very quickly say, oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about power. And power is part of agency. But as historians have gotten more thoughtful over the last, say, 75 years, I think we've gotten an even more deep and nuanced idea. So power is part of it, but I don't think the whole definition. Now, if you had gone back 100 years ago and you were reading history, the references to agency that you are likely to find were going to focus the power to shape historical events on a very small group of people, political and military leaders, kings, presidents, generals. Most of the history that you would have read 100 years ago or earlier has a very kind of straightforward concept of agency. Powerful people at the top make decisions, and the rest of us have to live with the consequences of those decisions. This is the great man theory of history that you might have been familiar with if you were an undergraduate history major. The idea that the past is shaped by a small group of very powerful people who are usually men, often white, and that they exist at the top of the structure and they have all of the power. As historians have gotten better at researching the past and thinking about the past and exploring the interconnections in the past, we've gotten a much more subtle sense of the many, many different ways that people can exercise influence over events. So I think of agency not simply as power and not necessarily as like political power or military power, although those are kinds of agencies, but also, the ability to exert leverage in some way or to put pressure or influence on things, ways that are maybe not as easy to see as winning a presidential election or marching an army into an enemy capital. But if you start looking at examples from the past, you'll see all sorts of ways that people, not just at the top of the pyramid, but many of the sort of regular grassroots people are exercising their agency too, whether they are trying to create pressure or leverage or exert influence. One of my students last semester just said, "Oh, I get it. It's juice. It's the ability to make things happen in all of the ways that that can manifest." And so when I'm thinking about agency, I'm thinking about who has it in a given situation, where it comes from, how it can be used, where its limitations are. No one has kind of universal power to simply make the world look the way they want. And so we want to think too about the ways in which it is circumscribed. And then when you're getting really sophisticated, thinking about how other historical actors are exercising their agency, because often uh, attempts to exert pressure or leverage or influence are coming into contact with other similar efforts. They're acting in coalition or they're acting in opposition. And this is where our thinking about the past really starts to come into sharper focus. So it's certainly true that the President of the United States or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff exerts a very specific and pretty dramatic kind of agency. Those are positions that carry with them a lot of power. But that's not to say that people who are not elected to high office or have risen to the top of, Citibank or the United States Navy or other powerful institutions have no power. If you're a teacher and you are part of a union locally, that is an effort to pool a lot of people's influence into a coordinated effort to exercise agency, better working conditions, higher wages, more freedom in the classroom. Like labor unions, a very clear kind of agency, and one that is being expressed by people who are not, the superintendent or the secretary of education. And one of the things that I find so useful about thinking about agency, and I have it at the forefront of my brain almost all the time now, and I'm trying to make sense of the past. It's thinking about where is the influence flow, where does the power come from, where is the pressure coming from, and it's fascinating to see how many layers there are. So if we were to look at this 18th century ad that Thomas Jefferson writes, he's placing an ad for a man that he claims is property. Jefferson describes him and says, Here's his physical description. He's valuable. He's run away. I want him back, and I'm willing to offer a reward. And if we were to look at this first, the most obvious example of historical agency, I think, is right there at the bottom, Jefferson himself, right? Where does his power come from? It comes from his wealth. It comes from his position at the top of the colonial elite. Some of Jefferson's agency comes from the fact that he's white and he's born into a system that attaches a great deal of privilege and authority to whites and keeps blacks very much, legally oppressed. So he has some legal agency, he has some economic agency, he has some intellectual agency that he is well connected. And there's a very clear sense of the kind of power that Jefferson has here. If this was 100 years ago, we probably would have stopped there as historians and said, well, Jefferson is the agent here because he's the person who's lost something and he's trying to get it back, and he is the person in power. I think a more sophisticated look at agency says there's another agent here. Maybe not someone who's quite as powerful as Jefferson, but might bring our attention up to Sandy, the subject of the ad. And Sandy's interesting because he has very little power. I mean, he exists within a system that is designed to keep him powerless or as close to powerless as possible. So, legally, he cannot be educated. He's not allowed any basic civil rights. He's not allowed to save money. And yet, in this ad, we have evidence that Sandy has exercised the one kind of agency that he has, which is to run away, as Frederick Douglass says, to steal himself to freedom. And so while we've got, there's no question that Jefferson has more power. We've also got evidence of agency happening in other places, right? This whole advertisement is set into motion by Sandy's decision to exercise the one kind of agency he has, which is to try to escape the situation. And so he has that very it's singular but unmistakably powerful ability to affect historical events. He's run away and he has put this other set of events into motion. So we start to look at in other places and we see that agency is like layers. There are often lots of things happening at once. And sometimes those things are not even necessarily human agency. We were all alive during the pandemic. You remember 4 years ago, the unemployment rate had dropped to remarkably low levels. And one of the things that happened when unemployment dipped below 4% is that entry-level jobs at fast food places like McDonald's were offering starting wages around $18 an hour. Now, that's not because the McDonald's franchisees suddenly found themselves, being overwhelmingly benevolent and magnanimous and wanted to share the wealth with people. We have a kind of market mechanism sending messages and putting pressure on the owners. If you want people to work at your business, you want to keep your business profitable, you are going to have to offer them more. And so there is a kind of market agency that is pushing wages up due to this interesting the interesting plunge in unemployment levels that has nothing to do with Big Macs or the guy who owns the local McDonald's off the freeway, but that person is kind of caught up in the situation and is then exercising the agency that they have. I'm going to make the decision to raise the starting wage in an effort to lure in new workers. I find this way of thinking about influence and leverage and pressure hugely important for historical interpretation and historical thinking. And I remind my students all the time that this is a skill that works and is useful in your kind of day-to-day life, trying to make sense of the world we're living in now, which is going to be someone else's history in 25 or 50 years, and trying to make sense of things that are happening in the recent past or in current events about who has leverage, where does it come from, is just I think an incredibly important and valuable habit of mind to cultivate. And once you start thinking about this, you start to see some really interesting patterns that are important, but not necessarily intuitive. So if we think back to 2021, the first year or so of Joseph Biden's presidency. Now, Biden, as president of the United States, has a tremendous amount of power. A lot of that power is, derives from his position as, the head of the executive branch. I would go out and say that in 2021, Joe Biden was the most important national Democratic figure, the most influential national Democratic figure in the United States. I would say that the second most influential Democrat in the United States was Joe Manchin, the senior senator from West Virginia, which is kind of interesting. There is no part in the Constitution that says the president shall, be the chief executive and the senior senator from the nation's 39th most populous state shall be the second most important person. But Joe Manchin found himself in a curiously powerful position due to a whole bunch of accidents that were not under his control, but which effectively gave him a veto over whatever legislation the president was trying to pass. If you can remember back to November and December of 2020, Republicans had won 50 Senate seats, Democrats had won 48 Senate seats. They had a bare chance to capture an even 50-50 split. And a 50-50 split in the Senate favors the president's party because the vice president captures the tie-breaking vote. We had two runoff elections in the state of Georgia that the Democrats were long shots to win either of and terrible long shots to win both, and yet somehow managed to secure both of those seats. Where did that agency come from? Well, a lot of it came from the voters in Georgia who turned out to vote in the runoff elections. They were massing their individual power into voting blocks. The Democrats win both of those seats. That means there are 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans in the Senate. Democrats hold a tie-breaking vote, but that's only if they keep 50 people together. Joe Manchin, as the most conservative senator on the Democratic side, then had an incredible amount of agency because it was his 50th vote that would determine whether or not Biden's legislation got passed. And so as a result, Joe Manchin, through all of these kind of the combination of accidents, elevated him to a temporary place of enormous power in which he had a de facto veto over a lot of Democratic legislation. None of that is in the Constitution. You have to look and ask questions about where is this power coming from? Where is this leverage coming from? What are its limitations? And this is an interesting historical example of a bunch of odd things happening together and lining up in a way to make one particular person unusually powerful for a moment at least. We can see examples like that throughout history. We could go back to the Montgomery bus boycott. On the right, you can see the primary source that requires Rosa Parks to show up in court. And Rosa Parks is clearly someone who has, very considerable agency in starting the bus boycott, right? In refusing to give up her seat on that fateful day. But as good historians, we want to keep peeling back the onion and looking for additional layers. And you quickly see that there's a lot else going on, that Rosa Parks' incredibly brave, singular action of refusing to give up her seat is built on the efforts of the entire Black community in Montgomery. And you see some of the minutes there on the left hand. This is not the sort of spur of the moment decision of a woman who's decided that she's, too physically exhausted to move, but is in fact the culmination of months of planning and coordination. And part of the agency that the Black community has in this situation is their economic power. The bus system in Montgomery requires both white fares and Black fares to stay solvent. They need people to ride the buses. And when the Black community withdraws their support of the bus system at incredible sacrifice to themselves, right? They have to walk places, they have to organize car share, they have to expose themselves to the elements, but they withdraw their fees and they suddenly exert this kind of economic influence over the white part of Montgomery that wants to keep the buses going. And so we've got not just the one person whose name we all know, but different layers of leverage and pressure and people coordinating in order to maximize their influence. We see this in the summer of 1863, the different kinds of ways that even, the same administration can exercise agency. In 1863, the Lincoln administration begins drawing names to draft soldiers into the Union Army. And so they're using legal pressure, they're using the force of law to compel people to join the army. And many people, particularly in Democratic strongholds like New York City, regular folks who are now being required to join the military say, I don't want to join this war. And they exercise a different kind of agency, the agency of mob violence. They engage in a sort of 3-day long spasm of urban rioting, and they burn down huge parts of Manhattan. And the Lincoln administration responds with a different kind of agency by calling down regiments from the Union Army to put down the riots at gunpoint, as you see on the right there. And so we've got, just in this one event, we've got different kinds of pressure, different kinds of leverage, from legal to violent military power, that are all being used to try to convince people to behave in a certain way. Agency is just one of the most valuable tools that we have to working things out and thinking about where the power is and where it comes from. Hugely important. The last interpretive tool I want to introduce to you is hindsight. And this is a word that most of us are familiar with. We hear the phrase hindsight is 2020 a lot. There'll be a lot of hindsight and second guessing on Monday after the Super Bowl, a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking. Hindsight refers to this idea that a lot of things in the past are clear only when you know how things turn out. And when I talk to just kind of regular people on the street, they often say, oh, well, hindsight is so valuable as a historian. That must be your number one tool because you know how things turn out. And it can be valuable, but it can also be dangerous because hindsight gives away the ending. And that is not how the historical actors themselves are experiencing events. And so when I'm thinking about hindsight as a historian, I'm often thinking about ways to turn off my hindsight and to remind myself, like, what are the limitations that the historical actors themselves operated under? What could they see? What could they not see? What could have happened differently? We think about hindsight all the time if you're thinking about turning points and the space race or the Battle of Gettysburg or whatever as turning points in history. You're using hindsight. I encourage you to work with your students to practice turning hindsight off, though, in particular moments, because it can be really unhelpful and counterproductive to constantly know and remind yourself you know how things end. This is the headline of the Times Dispatch the morning after news about the Titanic sinking arrived. If you know how the story ends, and most of us do with the Titanic, then you can say, well, that's a terrible decision. Don't get on the boat. It's clearly not unsinkable. Here, they should have done this. They should have done that. But that isn't at all how historical actors encounter the world. And we want to practice kind of limiting ourselves sometimes to only what they're aware of and what they know and what they can see. We could jump to, late colonial America. That's Eli Whitney on the left, and you can see his patent for the cotton gin. If you watch the old Ken Burns Civil War documentary, one of the scholars there says that the voiceover says that Eli Whitney, in inventing a cheap way to refine cotton fiber, kind of sets in motion the entire Civil War. And that's really using hindsight. But I think it's also slightly problematic because it's very easy, if you know how things end, to go back and try to look for the connections and say, oh yes, right, this is going to grow the institution of slavery, and that's going to result in ultimately in a war that leaves 700,000 Americans dead. But that's, to use a fancy historical term, teleological, right? We're starting with an endpoint and we're trying to figure out how we got there. And that is not at all how people experience the past, and the people who are living through it are looking into the future as one of dozens or hundreds of possible outcomes. And I always tell my students, one of the most useful things to think about is the way in which, our moment, someone in 50 years is going to be writing the history of 2025, and they will know how things turned out. And they'll say, well, you can see that it was this, this, and the other thing. But here in February 2025, does anyone know what's going to happen in American politics? Does anyone know how the Russian-Ukraine war is going to turn out? Does anyone know who's going to win the Super Bowl on Sunday? Right? These are things that are still possibilities to us, and we want to practice the skill of getting back into the mindset of the people in the past and limiting ourselves to what they could see, because often that's going to free up uh, even better insights than just going back and saying they must have gone from here to here to here. So, perspective, agency, and hindsight, all of these things are being harnessed in the service of generating insights that help us answer questions about cause and effect. At the end of the day, it's a huge part of what we want to do. Change over time, and why is it happening? Um, so I use the second order thinking skills to shake loose some new insights and maybe give me new questions to ask. And this feels like a good time to do some think alouds. So what I've got is two sets of documents, and we're going to do what we did in the first webinar. I'm going to
Right.
shuffle through them. I'm going to talk about just my internal monologue, but I'm going to narrate it out loud. And what I'd like you guys to do is try to listen and see which of the, historical interpretive tools I'm leaning on the hardest. As with historical thinking, there's a lot of overlaps. You're going to hear me do other things, but I'm going to try to deliberately do one thing a little more emphatically. And I want to see if you can kind of hear what's going on there. So, Dr. Grencevich, are you ready to play along at the home game?
I sure am.
Here we go then. So I'm going to pick up a set of images from the Library of Congress, and this is like what I was thinking the first time I saw them. Okay, so this is a little scary because it looks like there's a kind of standoff starting here. And we've got some sort of well-dressed black folks on the left, it seems like, and then on the right we've got, it looks like, I don't know, state troopers, police officers, and I don't know, there feels like the threat of some violence here, and I'm afraid it's going to go badly for the people on the left because the people on the right are like wearing helmets and riot gear and have sidearms, and that's scary. There seems like there's a lot of power on the right-hand side. Oh, this is interesting. So the people on the left, it looks like there's a lot of them, right? So they have numbers, which is, I guess, a different kind of power. Like there's a lot of people. They seem to be mostly really well dressed, and they are all acting in unison, right? So that's a different kind of power, strength in numbers. And yeah, okay, so this has gone maybe the way that I was thinking it would in the first shot, where there's like a lot of like violent action being taken towards people who I guess are protesters, and that seems bad, right? This is a kind of power that is just raining down in like beatings. Um, there's one other thing that kind of occurred to me now, because like these pictures come from somewhere, and there's a guy in the back there who appears to be photographing this. And there must have been photographers or news crews present because that's where we have the pictures. And that actually feels like a kind of power too, because these are like appalling images that are going to go out. And I wonder if this group is counting on the fact that this will be documented to maybe help them advance whatever cause they're in service of. There's a lot going on here. Okay, scene.
Hey, great modeling.
Let's open up the polls,
All right.
and let's see what you think you heard the most of. And I find myself when I'm doing these in class, even when I'm deliberately trying to heavily hit one thing, it's impossible to just do one thing because the skills, it's like a lockpick kit. You got a couple things going at the same time. So if you heard me do something else, you're almost certainly right. But I tried to lean pretty heavily on one thing,
Yep.
and see what we got.
All right. Let's give you 10 more seconds. We have 3/4 of the people who are here with us tonight now, more than that, who have participated. So make your final selections in the next 5 seconds or so.
This is where the Jeopardy thing would be playing
I
with the
know,
mouse
I
stuff.
know. I'm not going to sing it with my sick voice,
No,
poor
no.
singing
I
skills.
think also we're
That's,
on the hook for paying for
that's
it.
bound to
Either
be
of us
very bad.
whistle
All
or
right,
sing.
all right, ending the poll. Here are the results. 29% of participants thought it was perspective,
Okay.
68% thought it was agency, and 4% thought it was hindsight.
So I was definitely leaning most heavily on agency.
Mhm.
There's a little bit of hindsight in there, and I think there's a fair amount of perspective in there that's just unavoidable. And as I said, you're never doing just one thing, right? You're using all of these tools in concert, and certainly there's perspective there that I talked about, and there's perspective there just in these different photographs, right? So we're seeing things from different angles. So agency is the thing I was trying to lean on the hardest, but no wrong answers. Let's do another one. Why not? Like,
Great.
let's just hear what it sounds like. This is a document that I pulled out of the Library of Congress. I had no familiarity with it when I saw it for the first time. It's not an area of my specialty, so let me talk you through it. Okay, so we have got a political cartoon, and I am just going to guess, based on 25 years of being a historian, that it's racist, because that is usually a pretty fair guess with cartoons that are from like this period, which looks to me like maybe late 19th, early 20th century. I'm going to guess that the viewpoint is like anti-Chinese. So let's dive in. We got a Chinese figure uh, stuck outside the Golden Gate of Liberty. So I guess it's somebody who's trying to get in. He looks pretty unhappy. I guess because he's been locked out. Notice communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians, and hoodlums are welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. Okay, so like all these people that the cartoonist seems to think are undesirable are let in, but we are not allowing in this Chinese laborer. And the caption here is the only one barred out. Okay, so maybe this viewpoint is not anti-Chinese. This actually might be a kind of view of the Chinese. Oh yeah, he's sitting on, look at his baggage, industry, order, peace, and sobriety. Oh, okay. So, like, this seems to be a viewpoint that the American government should be letting in Chinese people. The enlightened American statesman says we must draw the line somewhere, you know. Oh, and that seems to me like maybe some, uh, it's something a little ironic there. So we've got somebody, yeah, the viewpoint here seems to be like, why are we letting in all these terrible people listed on the sign? And then a pretty generous depiction of the main character as a Chinese worker who's bringing all these good things but has been barred. Okay, so this viewpoint is not at all what I was thinking when I sat down to look at this at first. I'm glad I kind of exercised a little historical thinking and did a little more consideration before I just jumped to conclusions. And scene. You know
Another.
the drill?
All right. We are ready to launch poll two. So again, the options are the same. Did you see modeling of perspective, agency, or hindsight? And people are ready for this one.
Good. Just on the clickers, ready to
On the
go.
clickers. Yeah.
There are no cash prizes and there is no mention
No.
historical argumentation, but it's still a fun game to play. And I'm doing this more with my students, and I'm really having good results. It's not just about it's not just about getting right answers. In fact, I don't think it's about getting right answers primarily. I've had a couple of occasions where it starts an interesting conversation, and I'll say, I was trying to hit on agency, and somebody will say, yeah, but you talked a lot about X, Y, and Z.
Uh-huh.
Isn't that something else? And I'm like, yeah, that's interesting. What else did you guys hear? And so we're talking about historical thinking as a process rather than as an endpoint, which to me is a huge part of what we're
That's
trying to
great.
accomplish as educators.
Yep. Okay, I think we're ready to close the poll.
Lay it on me.
All right. No one selected agency.
Nobody, zero.
No one. I haven't seen a goose egg in a poll in a while.
I don't know that I've ever seen one.
No. 14% of participants thought hindsight, and a whopping 86% selected perspective.
So perspective was what I was leaning on the most heavily there, and I was using words like viewpoint and point of view a lot to talk about how the artist is presenting this main character at the center. And so I think perspective was the thing that you heard the most of. But again, it's about trying to listen and deepen your understanding rather than get the right answer. I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Grencevich, and I will be online for Q&A when we're done at the top of the hour.
Great, thank you. All right, how does that look? Dr. Hamner, Alondra, can you just confirm for me that that's okay? I'm
Looks great. Yep.
trying sharing a little bit differently
Looks
right
good.
now so I can still see myself. Thank you. Okay, everyone. I am just going to take a little bit of time to go over some of the finer points of assignment 2 with all of you. As I said in the opening, there are some skills that you saw modeled today, practicing historical thinking that Dr. Hamner did for us, that you will employ as you complete assignment 2. So this on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see the template that you will fill out if you have not yet looked at this. And this template is meant to help you think over the long term about the different primary and secondary sources that you are looking at, that you're assembling together as you are beginning to make an argument about the past, an argument about change over time. So this assignment is called a plan because you should be seeing the assemblage of different sources coming together to make a plan for your argument. Okay, so everything should be pretty straightforward in terms of what you put where. If there are any questions about this, just let me know. You are going to continue with the same primary source pack from the item that you selected for Module 1. So you are stuck in that sandbox in that primary source packet. If you decide that you do not want to be stuck in that place, just let me and your section facilitator know. We can certainly make some modifications, but you are relatively bound into either Typhoid Mary or the Enrollment Act. So I hope you like the pool of resources that you're looking in. So what this assignment is going to do is ask you to keep practicing the skills that were introduced to you, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 50th time in Module 1. So you are going to look at a new source from the primary source pack, and you're going to identify a new source from the Library of Congress. And that leads me to the next slide. But before I do that, you're also going to be reviewing a secondary source that you may have looked at in preparation for the discussion assignment for Module 2. Okay, so in searching for a new source, this is one of the skills that you're going to be practicing. Maybe it's new. Again, maybe this is the 50th or 100th time that you have worked with the Library of Congress database. The assumption here is that this is a good time to introduce all participants to the practices of looking at the Library of Congress database, to practicing good research skills. So it doesn't matter how much experience you have with this. If you have no experience with this, this is just a good place to practice. So you will be looking at 3 new skills: searching the Library of Congress for a new source, engaging in historical analysis. So using one of the tools of historical analysis that Dr. Hamner modeled for you tonight: perspective, agency, or hindsight. And as he advised, hindsight might not be the most helpful. It might be something that comes easily to us as historians, as teachers, as students. So I really encourage you to work on practicing perspective and agency, especially if hindsight feels really familiar. Work on something that you're not terribly comfortable with. This is the place to try out new ideas and new perspectives. The last thing that you're going to do at the end of this assignment is start pulling together an argument, and you're going to make a 0 draft of your thesis. The final assignments for this course in Module 3 and Module 4 are going to ask you to create a thesis and various drafts of a thesis statement. And this is where you're going to begin to do that here. So there are a couple parameters that are listed in the assignment directions about what a good thesis statement should look like. And one thing that I want to advise that's a little bit different about what we're doing here is that the thesis statement should have something to do with the theme for National History Day for 2025. So rights and responsibilities in history. You are very well resourced for completing this full assignment. And here I'm just pointing out the different resources that exist currently on Google Classroom that can help you draft help you draft a thesis statement and help you search the Library of Congress. If you find that these are not sufficient for you and you would like some one-on-one time, you are always welcome to email me or your section facilitator to get a bit more help, maybe just a push in the right direction or affirmation that you're already in the right direction. Way back when in mid-January, which maybe was 3 weeks ago or maybe 3 years ago, it's hard to tell some days, I posted a really wonderful resource from our NHG friends at the Ohio History Connection, a guide for younger learners. It's intended for fourth and fifth graders, but I think has excellent usefulness far beyond that age level or grade level on how to create a thesis statement. So I've included a couple different screenshots from that guide here to encourage you all to take a look at this as you're creating your thesis statements yourselves, and that this might be something really helpful for you to bring into your own classrooms as you're instructing students across grade levels and abilities of how and why to create a thesis statement. So here again is just pointing out some really lovely tips, framing that you'll find within this 3-page guide. Finally, for help with making sure that the thesis zero draft that you come up with and the thesis statement that you'll continue to develop through this course does pertain to rights and responsibilities in history, a reminder of the wonderful resources that exist on the NHG website. So there you'll find the theme book, the theme narrative, a short video less than 10 minutes that you can watch that you have been assigned to watch already. So hopefully you have. And then a worksheet that we call the theme book graphic organizer that you might find a useful exercise to just organize your thoughts, to think about Typhoid Mary or the Enrollment Act and how it has to do with balance. Finally, look ahead. This is available to you, but just a roundup of what you can expect for Module 3. Again, all of the materials for Module 3 will become available for you on Google Classroom starting on February 14th. So you still have about a week and a half left to finish up things for Module 2 before we are officially halfway through the course. Okay, and with that, let's move over to our Q&A portion of the night. So Dr. Hamner, Alondra, I invite you back. For those of you who are on a tight time frame, it's just 2 minutes before the hour. So go ahead, scan the QR code, follow the link, and you can excuse yourselves and enjoy the rest of your night. For those of you who are interested in sticking around for the Q&A, we've got time for that. And it looks like we already have a question.
Cool.
Alondra, do you want to share the question with us?
Yes, sorry, I'm trying to scan through it real quick.
Okay, it's a biggie.
Okay, what other suggestions do you have to get high school students to fully grasp the idea of, given all the technology, social media, and overall understanding of the bigger picture that has come before them, that has in a way helped shape them or their generation?
Yeah, I'm sort of so I'll be honest, I'm kind of struggling with this with my own students this semester in a good way, like in a healthy way. And I think I'm struggling with it in ways that I struggled with it when I was primarily a student of history. Like that it's hard to get yourself out of the moment you exist in, the moment you live in. And in fact, I think one of the things that got me interested in history in the first place was like the puzzles that came up when I understood how different people's experiences were from mine. So as a military historian, the thing that got me interested in the past was reading these stories about people who had done things I just could not imagine doing. And I was, repeatedly confronted with this idea that like their world just is different in almost every way. Like the past is a foreign country that you cannot visit. With my students this semester, and this came up like yesterday, we're reading a lot of John C. Calhoun speeches, the South Carolina senator, who in the 1830s begins making this very like affirmative defense of slavery, not that it's a necessary evil for economic development, but that it's a positive good. And some of the more sensitive students, I have great students this semester, by the way. I hope yours are as good as mine. A young woman in the back row said, like, this just sounds evil, was the word she used. Just it sounds awful, and it is awful. And so one of the things that I'm doing to help them appreciate how different things are, this is going to sound like a glib answer, but it's not, is like a lot of primary sources. I'm just kind of hammering home that the way they looked at the world, their basic assumptions about how the world worked, their beliefs, their value system, um, that all of those things, we exist in one set of assumptions and beliefs and values, and that other people in the past existed in other very different systems. And one way to I think, kind of crack into that through that shell is just to have them read a lot of things or look at a lot of things that show how different the world was. Dr. Grenzovich, you may have some ideas here too, but um, it's useful for me as an instructor when I get an aha moment if I'm looking at a primary source, like, wow, it's not just that this person has different answers to the questions I have about the world. Like they have a whole different set of questions, or like what they are interested in is just completely different than what I would be interested in this situation. And I think it's just okay to tell students like it's a different world, not just in terms of like the obvious stuff, like, well, their fashion was different and they've listened to different music on a different kind of music player. That stuff's there too, but also just like what they thought was important or significant or worth worrying about is often just like vastly different. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I've had similar success with looking at primary sources, and in a way that I had never, ever even intended. This was a strategy that I came upon completely by accident, thinking about how not to project the feelings, the knowledge, the technology, the experience, the lived reality of a person in the present day onto the past. To think that people in the past might have thought the same as you and had similar reactions to you. Um, I was taking my class, a group of high school seniors, to the archives for a visit, and we were looking at different versions of cookbooks from across the 20th century. And one of the things that the students realized were all the different ways that recipes have been written and the different kinds of knowledge that is assumed that the reader would have. So it was a small piece that I think helps students just begin to crack into the idea that these people in the past had a very different lived reality, and they were able to then extend that knowledge over the course of the rest of the semester because they'd had this exercise early on in the semester about how just knowledge about cooking practices could be so fundamentally different that they read in these cookbooks that you want to make a dough and cook it in a quick oven. Well, what's a quick oven? So we had good conversations about that, but just this glimpse into this idea of what this portion of people in the past knew about their world and how it was so different really helped them extend their historical worldview.
Sounds really fascinating. And one of the things that is kind of my go-to if I'm trying to solve a teaching problem is to kind of start with the insight I want them to have and work backwards. And so another thing that is coming up in tomorrow's class, so I'm teaching a 19th century history class, The students are really struggling with the Democratic and Republican parties in the 1850s. And it's pretty clear to me that the reason they're struggling with them is because they imagine that the Democratic and Republican parties in the 1850s are essentially the Democratic and Republican parties of 2025. Like they're sort of
Mm-hmm.
imagining people, and it just doesn't work. And one of the reasons it doesn't work is because the names have changed, but the functions of these two organizations is completely different. And so what I've done is I've grabbed a couple of short statements about the party platforms in the 1856 election, and I've handed them out, and they're pretty short. Um, and then I've asked them to identify which party is, in favor of firearm control, and which party is the party in favor of a woman's right to, reproductive freedom, and which party is wants to restrict immigration from Mexico, and which party is worried about inflation, and sort of like contemporary issues that you hear about. And they soon discover that you can't answer those questions. Like the party platforms, it's not that they're dodging the answers or that they're being vague or they're engaging in political doublespeak. Like those just aren't the questions of the 1850s. Like the parties don't think to take positions on those things because they're engaging with a different set of questions. And so the first part of this exercise is for the students to go through the platforms and say, like, I don't see anything about this in here, and to say, yes, you're right, right? Those aren't the issues. Our hindsight is kind of clouding our ability to
Yeah.
see things clearly. What are the issues that they're engaged in? What are the things that they're offering, political solutions to? And this whole exercise can take, if they've done the reading the night before and it's 2 paragraphs, the whole discussion takes like 10 minutes in class. It's not a super long thing, but it puts them in touch with like, wow, these political organizations existed to fulfill really different functions 150 years ago.
Yep. Good conversation. I think we could talk about this for a long, long time, but we do have another question
Yeah.
in the queue.
Okay. It seems so this teacher is redoing the Constitution role play. Um, and a couple of years ago, there was a complaint about being labeled slaves, even though it was a
Mhm.
role play. How would you address that?
I would address that in the most straightforward way possible, which is just changing my terminology. So rather than referring to someone as a slave, I would refer to them as enslaved, like an enslaved worker.
Mm-hmm.
If you're referring to someone, which was common when I was in high school in the 90s, like, oh, so and so was a slave, whether you mean to or not, you're kind of reducing them to property and to the most unpleasant fact of their life that has been forced on them. And if you refer to, so and so and a carpenter who was enslaved or an enslaved farmhand, you are referring to them first by their humanity and then by their condition, secondly. So the way that I've responded to that is just to kind of change the vocabulary that I use. It's super simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will second that and share that there is a wonderful resource. One of the most recent resources that we have, and here I have a copy of
Yeah.
a print copy of the book, a resource that we did about African American history, which contains a really wonderful essay on proper terminology and using proper terminology. And this is something that I will share with everyone, so you can take a look at that. Okay.
Awesome. Okay, what would be a good strategy activity to teach middle schoolers that our understanding of historical events can change?
Dr. Gretzvich, you want to take that one first?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I don't have something off the top of my head that I can share with you that's in my teaching pocket or my
I
teaching
do
bag
because
pocket.
only
Ah,
because I've done it.
then it's all yours, Dr. Hamner.
National History Day. So the
Yeah.
simplest thing you can do, if you have a library access,
Mhm.
is to go get an early version of a middle school textbook. And I mean, dig
Ah,
back to the 1950s, or get three versions. Get something from the 1950s, get something from the 1980s, and get your current one. And go to the same chapter where they're covering anything. The institution of slavery happens to be a pretty good one for stark change over time, although it may be that may be a little much for middle schoolers, but the Constitutional Convention, the bus boycott, you can pick anything and go to each of these, look how that was covered in 1952, look how it was covered in 1982, and look how it was covered in 2022. And each of those books should be written, for about a sixth grade reading level. But you'll discover that the way that they present things are really different. The people that they think are important and where the spotlight is and who are the important actors,
Mhm.
that will all change. And even a seventh grader can see like, wow, I would have been reading a completely different book if I had been born 75 years ago. That's also, by the way, like a super sophisticated thing to do. So I applaud you for doing that. I didn't get that kind of insight until I was like a second year graduate student,
Mhm.
but it's a cool thing you can do. My nephew just started ninth grade, but the last 3 years he was in middle school, and he developed kind of an interest in like looking at my old books to be like, oh, this is not at all how we're learning it now.
Yeah.
And it made him feel like kind of smug and in on the secret. So it was
Yeah.
cool. It was a cool exercise in that sense.
Great. That's a wonderful suggestion. Um, and a thanks from the person who asked it for the response. That's a wonderful thing to bring to your classroom. I am impressed that your students are up to the challenge to think about the
Absolutely.
change of change over time, or the change of narratives that attempt to explain change over time.
I did just a short exercise, like as a throwaway in my class last week. Granted, it's an upper level college class, but I picked a couple of pages on the chapter on the institution of slavery from a textbook, a Virginia State history textbook that was published in 1958. And I just had scans of the pages and I put them up. And the students looked at them and they were appalled. I mean, they were laughing and then they were shocked, and it was great. And we didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, but they were very clear, like, oh my God, you couldn't, not only could you not teach it that way, but you couldn't say these things in public anymore. And I was like, this textbook was still in use in the 70s. And it got them kind of thinking very much about how things change.
Yeah. And the other thing that another participant has said is to think about perspective, and I think also think about agency, and at least in the contemporary setting, to think about where history books are published and for whom history textbooks are published. So compelling things to think about that we can put our skills of historical thinking to work, to think about historical textbooks. Who they are for, who they are by, who they impact, whose stories they are meaning to tell. Okay. Looking at any other
It looks
questions.
like we have
Yeah, we have a couple
two
more.
more. It says when you bring up I'm saying sorry, butchering it.
Uh,
Historiographical debate, meaning when in the year specifically.
That
um,
that begs the question. Dr. Hamner, can you tell us what historiography is?
Yeah, historiography. So now we're getting way deep into the weeds, and I
Yeah.
am 100% here for it. I love it. I
Uh-huh.
love it. Historiography, again, is not something that I was even, let in on until I was, 2 or 3 years into my PhD. Historiography is the history of the history. So history is interested in, uh, the things that Abraham Lincoln did as president. Historiography is interested in how historians' views of Lincoln's presidency have changed over time. So it's a very uh, it's a meta kind of analysis of how people writing about Abraham Lincoln in 1889 and 1932 and 1965 and 1988 and 2002, how that changed over time. At the undergraduate level, and I think at the high school and middle school level, I don't do very much of it. So I would the answer to when do I bring it up? When in the year? Very sparingly. So I will pick maybe two things that I think are relevant and important, um, and I will do a sort of sidebar. So in my Civil War class, there's a historiographical debate about whether the Civil War was inevitable or whether it could have been prevented. And I will sort of step aside and say historians have been arguing about this for 160 years, and they've kind of collected into groups that are called schools. And here is one group's argument for why the war was inevitable, and here's another group's argument for why the war could have been avoided. And I don't dwell there too long, but I'll do that maybe two times in the middle of the semester. First of all, because I think it's a useful interpretive tool and it shakes them out of this idea that all historians agree about why things happen, that like historians argue with each other all the time. It's all we do. And also because I think it's useful for them to be thinking about, do I think this argument is more persuasive than this argument? And I'll do a little polling in class. So I asked them to weigh in whether they thought the Civil War was inevitable or avoidable like 2 weeks ago. And we get to the midpoint of the semester around spring break, I'll ask them to vote again, and I want to see who's changed their vote. And then we'll talk a little bit about why. But I don't do a terrific amount of that because it's a really difficult concept to wrap your head around. And so I do it in a place where if I think that the students are ready for it, or I think it has some instructional value.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to say that going down that could muddy the waters, but when
Yeah.
students just first wrapping their head around the idea of historical narratives being constructed in the first place or constructions in the first place, to think about changing constructions might do a little mind melting. That isn't.
Yes, it melted my brain when I
Yeah,
was like in graduate
absolutely.
school. I was like, what is
Absolutely.
this? I don't. And it in hindsight, it seems so obvious that if
Uh-huh.
I got out of undergrad, I was like, well, there are books in the library. I remember getting a very bad grade on something I wrote, and the instructor said, "You have used bad history." And I was like, "What do you mean I'm using bad history? It's all in the
All
library. They're
history.
all books
Yeah.
on George
Yeah.
Washington. Why are they in there if they're bad?"
Yeah.
And it was about 2 years later that I realized, oh wow, a book about George Washington from 1927 is probably not as good as a book about George Washington from 1987. And there are probably some reasons for that.
Sure.
And maybe I should start thinking about that. And I was a little embarrassed it took me that long to get it. But it's a sophisticated concept and it's hard to get. And it took me probably like a year and a half of thinking hard about it to really kind of get my brain to be able to flip back and forth between history and historiography.
Yeah. A worthwhile exercise nonetheless.
Yeah.
Well, I think our questions have dried up. So I thank everyone who submitted some really evocative questions for tonight. That was a wonderful discussion. A reminder that if you haven't yet, scan the QR code, follow the link, make sure that you complete the survey. Thank you to those of you who were able to join us live, and hello to those of you who are watching the recording at a later date. I wish you all safety in the impending storm, at least you, Dr. Hamner. But take care and stay safe, y'all.
Stay warm, everybody. Thanks for spending part of your week with us. We'll see you in March.
Bye-bye.